In a previous webinar, we explored how to make a working business model around an API. So now today in this event, we'll take that a step further to consider the benefits of treating any type of API as a product. We'll consider what that means and learn some of the usability tips to keep in mind when doing so. But first, what exactly do we mean by API as a product? Well, RESTful web APIs have become a standard method to connect digital ecosystems. And in recent years, a lot of startup companies have emerged that make their API their #1 selling point. And with the right management and gateways in place, you can pretty much easily wrap business logic around web endpoints to offer specialized functionality as a commercial service. But APIs have risen outside of public-facing services as well. If you look at digital modernization, cloud transitions, and the whole microservices revolution, all these things are bringing more and more APIs into production. A recent study by F5 actually estimated that there are over 200 million total APIs out there. And what we see in the public sphere is just a sliver of what is truly out there. I think many of these services exist as private applications and partner-to-partner integrations. So because of that, it's my view that API as a product shouldn't only be seen as a public business tool, but also as a mindset. And when you begin to adopt a product mindset around your API, you begin to place more emphasis on the developer experience around the integration. Designing a service for others to use outside of your internal team can influence better documentation, more consistency and standards, improved backward compatibility, better security, and so on. And if you think about it, a lot of these benefits will strike a chord for developer users, no matter how or where the API is consumed. So today we're going to try and shed some more light on some of these benefits of treating an API as a product, exploring what exactly it takes to create more human-centric API services. And I'm really excited about this one. We've brought in two phenomenal experts today with a lot of experience in this space, and both are actually Nordic APIs veteran speakers. First up, we'll be featuring Jason Harmon, CTO at Stoplight, with a presentation on why you should be taking a product approach to your APIs. After that, Shelby Switzer, a digital services expert at US Digital Service, will present ways to design human-centric APIs. With both of these experts, I think we'll get a really balanced perspective on what it means to deliver a product mindset to your APIs. And remember, for those tuning in live, please just write in your questions into the chat throughout the event, and we'll take them all in a Q&A after these two presentations. So thanks for being with us, Jason, and take it away whenever you are ready.
Cool, thanks, Bill. In case anyone's tuned in that knows me, I'll give you a moment to absorb the shock of beardlessness. Sorry, I got lazy over the holidays. All right, so I'm gonna give a caveat up front. You know, you have to pick a title for these things months in advance, and while this is the subject, I think it's my usual style of, like, you know, we'll talk about maybe what not to do more than what to do, because I don't know any better than you, but we'll see. So Stoplight is where I work, and of course I have to tell you a little bit about what we do. I promise it won't be a shill. Stoplight's a collaborative API design platform. What that means in practice is companies that are looking to, you know, take API seriously, become a platform company, things like this, right? Be API first, tend to look for, you know, how do we design APIs? And they come to us to look for that. We have kind of a blend of platform SaaS style approach, as well as a collection of open source projects. So, you know, check it out there. I did my marketing job. Who am I and why should you listen to me? So I'm CTO at Stoplight. I run our engineering, product, security, IT, so too many things. Hopefully you've tuned in before to our API Intersection podcast, and don't worry, I'll plug it again later. The background stuff, I promise I won't read to you, but basically what it says is the last 10 years, all I've done is work on helping companies work through their kind of API transitions, ranging from, you know, seed or early stage startups on up to, you know, big public companies. And I'm always kind of looking for, you know, what's applicable at any level, what's always true, right? By the way, I apologize for sniffling and maybe muting and coughing or something. I'm just getting over COVID, like a couple of days, so still a little rough. The first thing I always tell folks when they say, hey, we need to go build an API, what should we do? Is, a healthy dose of good old school product management goes a long ways. Don't get confused. This is just another product. It's different, right? But don't try to sort of reinvent the wheel. There's some fundamentals that you still need to get right. Of course, then the follow-up question is, what does that mean? Like, how do I do that? So that's really, I think, kind of, what we tried to pull together is a collection of kind of ideas on how to think about this, how to approach it. And then we'll kind of, look at the end on what happens if you don't. Again, that's kind of how I tend to look at things. So our kind of agenda, our overview here is taking a look at relationships and the role that this plays in, how you think about your APIs as a product. For product managers specifically, how you think about kind of your acceptance criteria, and I'll explain a little more what I mean by that. And then finally, business buy-in, because my experience is in a lot of environments where folks are still kind of working through justifying why this makes sense. Excuse me. Sorry, we're going to do that a few times. So the first is relationships. And I think if you've been reading up on the subject of APIs at all, this isn't really a shock that we should be thinking about connecting our company, or our product or our platform, or however you think about it, via APIs, is establishing a relationship. So if your job is to look at, hey, how can we use APIs to create these relationships, it makes sense to start there and really think about what kind of relationships might we be forming. So I recommend, really think about this as kind of, who are the constituents, who are the consumers? And, step one is you really need to put yourself in a customer-centric mindset. And I think, across all these sort of large-scale platform transformations, startup level bootstrapping APIs, it's the thing that works most, is really put yourself in the shoes of who's going to be using the thing. And really that can, for some organizations, be a real cultural shift. There's a tendency toward kind of, institutionalized thinking that can emerge, especially at larger scales. The second one is like, this is tricky because I don't know if you already have an API or not. And sometimes this is about, I've taken over this range of APIs that some developers made and I have to make sense of them. So that can be fortunate in that you can look at the data and kind of usage patterns, and that might tell you things. But more often than not, just talking to the folks that are using it most. So that's kind of the step one of data analysis, is who's power using your APIs, and really go talk to them and figure out, what are you trying to accomplish? What's kind of the value that you're getting out of this, and what would make it a lot easier, that sort of thing. And step three, you can tell, isn't really step three. It's like step 3A and B, because I couldn't figure out the best way to explain it. But the point here is trying to figure out really a primary kind of segregation of relationships, which is, do you have data that your customers are trying to access? Or do you have data that other platforms need to access on behalf of your customers? Is it going to require consent from your customers in order to provide that data? Is it raw data, which is frankly rarely useful? Most of the time you want some kind of aggregation or calculation going on, because if it was just storing raw data, you'd be a database as a product. Sorry if your database is a product, right? But a lot of times it's like, there's some additional value that you're putting on top of the data. So thinking through those things first really should help you start thinking about, what is the business relationship? So who is the consumer? Who's going to use this thing? And how are we relating on a business, sense? Start thinking about, it's like, how do we succeed together? So this is where, kind kind of success measures are useful. And I know I work in the exec world today, and those are the kinds of things I'm supposed to say. But truthfully, having some shared sense of, what would make you successful and how would I measure it as you consuming the APIs, and then reflecting back, how does that help our business, right? How is that good for us? These seem really fundamental, obvious things, but it's kind of surprising how often folks get caught up in the idea that this is a technical artifact, and I need to get down into the properties of what we're going to share and how much data we should and shouldn't. And like, take a breath. Who's connecting? What's your relationship going to be like? How are you going to grow together? Answer those questions first, because the rest may be irrelevant. So part of the reason that I really point out this difference between, is it a customer or is it a partner who's accessing it right up front, is one, your variance of complexity is huge on things like identity and auth. So a customer getting their own data, let's think of, like, say, the GitHub personal token kind of thing, right? Like, I'd like a token to get my own data. That's actually, from an implementation standpoint, you can do some dirty tricks and make that work most times pretty easily. You start getting into, hey, I run XYZ platform and I'd like access to your customers' data. Granted, it may be for their benefit, they're asking for it. But that's a whole other ball of wax, right? Now you got to deal with things like OAuth, which implementing an OAuth provider is non-trivial. So that's important to know up front, certainly in terms of kind of scoping and complexity and, how big is this thing going to be? That makes a huge difference. And then the second bit, and I think this is where, we've, if you've been around the API space at all, you've seen all kinds of, bad ideas on how to monetize things. So if you don't really understand these constituents and what they find valuable in the integration, and on the other side, how it's valuable to your business, you may try to sort of, it's like you're going, oh yeah, let's have a great relationship while I dig my hands in your pocket, right? So, thinking about how are you building equity together with the consumer of this API long term? How can you grow your businesses together? And obviously, you don't want to do this for one connection. So hopefully you're able to look at that in an aggregate. But how can you all scale together? This is how the great platforms have scaled, right? Is by creating ways for everyone to grow together. And if you are looking at these kind of partner type scenarios where you're providing data on behalf of someone else, you're in that kind of OAuth flow, you've taken on the big complexity. A lot of times, directly monetizing that makes no sense, because you may be looking at, for instance, a common assumption I think that you can make is, hey, if we connect to other platforms that our customers value, and let's say you're in kind of a SaaS style business, their retention is going to skyrocket. They're not going to go away if if you are integrated into their workflow, for example. So why would I charge for that, right? So thinking through these relationships help you think about, the right way to kind of grow your business. And it may not be, API gets called, I get paid. It may not be that simple. And part of the reason for that, and the way that you need to think about it, is, will this generate positive network effects for our platform? So, the old adage, come for the tool, stay for the network. Customers come to you to maybe use the value of what you've built. But what is it beyond that direct usage that's valuable for them? Again, the scenario that, maybe that you're connected into a workflow, right? Far more valuable than just, I'm going to come use your tool. And from a relationship standpoint, the other thing to think about is, hey, you're inviting these developers to come, build connections into your platform. Those are powerful, personas, right? They can open the door to whole new flows of business. So really understanding them is pretty important, right? Another thing that I always love to call out here is that, a lot of times when you start kind of adding APIs into your business, you really need to start thinking like a marketplace and not think so much in kind of the traditional pipeline business, but rather think, who are who are the consumers of this information? Who are the producers of this information? How do they interact together, right? It certainly Harvard Business Review is a great source. I forget the author's name, but one of my favorite books, Platform Revolution, another good example. It's kind of the other side of platform. So sometimes we think of platform as componentized architecture, and that's true, especially if microservices are playing a role in how you build those external APIs. But the other side of it is thinking about how to be a transactional platform in some sense. And it's a whole, this can change the way you think about your business. I put the easy example, certainly from my recent past of, a platform like Expedia Group, where, automating these connections to suppliers, and that's the lifeblood of the business, right? If you don't have hotels and flights, then you're not in business, right? So in a place like that, it's more obvious. But I think a lot of folks end up with these connections and don't really think through, hey, we're creating this new kind of network around our business, and we should think of it as a marketplace. And from a business standpoint, it changes the way that you measure value. And again, when we reflect back on monetization, quite often the network effects are greater. In other words, the network you're building around your platform is of greater value to your business than sticking your hands in the pocket of every consumer of the API. In fact, you may look to try to incentivize them and share revenue with them, rather than trying to take money from them. So more nuanced view, right? And the other reason for this relationship type stuff, I certainly seen my share of API death march projects where the scope creep just explodes. And part of the reason why is, we didn't think through, oh gosh, there's 10, 5, 6 different kinds of relationships at play, and we have to build them all at once. So take it one relationship type at a time, right? Don't try to boil the ocean of all the ways that your platform could connect. And I certainly would say, if you have customers who get value out of getting their own data, great place to start, right? Give them a token, give them their own data. Nobody gets hurt. You don't have to worry about the legalities of consent and all this sort of stuff. But even in the partner kind of side of the world of, can we connect with another platform? You may have multiple ways of doing that that make sense to kind of scope down, right? So leaning back to, again, recent Expedia Group experience, I think there's 5 or 6 different kinds of partners that connect. That could be anything from, advertising to, obviously suppliers for, different travel products, things like that. Each of those has their own dynamic, right? And certainly different thinking about, monetization and things like that. If you're looking at this fresh on how do we go implement APIs, take them one at a time. You try to do that all at once, and your projects will snowball and everyone will be confused. All right, so that was the first one, relationships. The next step is much easier, which is, you're a product manager. You need to get sign off on building these APIs now. Maybe you've done all your homework, you understand the relationships. But, be a good product manager. You can't just trust your developer when they say, yep, it's done, I'm good. The API is built, checkbox complete, right? That's the default state and it's no good. And this is a one slider, which is just to say, APIs are unique, as a product, in the sense that it's not very easy necessarily to be customer centric in the way that you approach it, especially if you've come from a background of building user experiences. Building developer experiences is a different thing, but don't lose sight of describing what you're building in human customer terms, right? I certainly have been a longtime advocate of using tools like Cucumber, sort of behavioral driven development, things like this. There's certainly other approaches out there, but the point is, especially if you don't come from an engineering background and you're managing APIs, give yourself a way to describe the thing in a way that can be tested automatically. And kind of the middle piece here of repeatable automated testing. I mean, this is how you raise the bar on your quality. And the way I always tell folks is like, if you're managing an API and you're releasing bugs into production, that should only happen once for any sort of distinct bug. You should be able to immediately put a test in place that prevents that from happening again. Point being, compared to like a brittle UX environment, you can automate everything with APIs from a testing perspective. And in terms of relationships within your teams, this is great, right? You can sit down and define together in customer terms what this thing does. I don't really care how they call it necessarily, right? I do, but first, let's understand what it does. Agree on it in terms that can be turned into programmatic testing, and do that by default, right? As much as you have the capacity for it, do it for every story. And then when when sprint is coming up and we go, what did we get done? Those red tests turn to green and your sign off is done. You don't necessarily have to sit down and start calling APIs. Now, you can, but that's time that you can spend on kind of exploratory and taking a look at what is this like to actually use. But the functional aspect, you should be able to automate almost completely, and should press for that if you have engineering teams that aren't used to doing that. So that was an easy one. See, one slide compared to like 5 for the relationship type thing. The last one, and I always try to think about this from an API perspective, because there are still lots of companies out there who haven't quite figured out how to get started. And there are often champions inside the company who recognize all these things and are trying to figure out, I know we need APIs in these particular areas, and it would be a game changer, right? But I struggle to get funding and to get buy-in and support and get a team behind it, that kind of thing. So I'm going to bring you back to the beginning. It's just another product, and that's how you need to think about justifying it. Getting caught up in the technical weeds is not going to do you any good with a bunch of MBAs, right? And a bunch of executive types. You've really got to think about, how is this relevant as kind of a program? Because in most cases, building APIs is not just, put a product development team behind it, and go build the thing and you're done, right? You've got all kinds of artifacts to deal with, such as how are you going to document and publish this thing? Once it's out there, how are you going to support it? How are you going to manage iterative change, right? You really often got to ask for a lot more than just some engineers to build the API. And that's hard to ask for, right? It's hard to go say, I need a lot of money to go do all these things. And the first step is like, again, bring it back to basics. How is this good for our business? And keeping in mind the things we said before, it may not be as simple as, build the API and cha-ching, we get more money. Quite often there's kind of a longer game to it of building that network around your platform. And think about, when you do integrate, and this could be just with customers, in which quite often it's like you might be just reducing churn, right? That may be that you're just fixing your leaky bucket. Connecting to other partners, again, could just be reducing churn, right? Now, again, I have a SaaS view on things, and I know not everybody works in the SaaS business, but the point is, from your traditional channels of business, when you integrate, how does it change things? How is this going to shift your revenue patterns? I think most, modern executives understand, if we don't have an API strategy that is executing, we're in trouble. And if you have execs that don't recognize that, just go do some Google searching and pass them articles, right? Or use that as your intro to your deck. That is the world we're in now. You've got to be in the game, or you're going to be out of business, right? So the second bit is demonstrate the value of the API. Again, think less about, you don't need to do like, curl calls in front of execs. It's not going to go well, right? It's like, why am I looking at this programmer stuff. And when you think about, how much money you're going to need, it's like certainly scale is one of those things. How much maybe cloud compute, or, if you're still on bare metal, how many servers you're going to need, things like that. Think those are operational technical measures, right? Think more about, what's the business value going to be? What's the outcome going to be for the business? And again, that may be a journey to explain it, because it may not be as simple as we build the API and more transactions happen in your traditional sense. It may change the way that you look at it. And again, just a reminder, like it may take extra explanation to say, hey, we need to shift from, being a tool provider to being a marketplace that helps, different personas interact together on your platform. And putting things into that sort of supply and consumption kind of paradigm, especially for a lot of your kind of traditionally MBA trained executive types, can be a very useful way to really punch through and say, look, the API is just the connection point. But, we're talking about changing the way that we think about doing business now. Certainly use caution there on how far you're stepping on that first step, because you don't want to be like, hey, we want to upend the way we do business and take massive risks. It's like, how can you get started? But it can be a useful way to help explain these things and why it's such a big deal. And on some level is pick one thing, one relationship type, one connection, and just focus on, hey, we need to create this first connection point, right? And all of these other big ideas can come true in the future if we just get that ball rolling. And that's also to say that, creating marketplaces and, shifting into platform and all that stuff, these things take years. Find the most valuable connection point for the consumers that make it happen, right? So in our own business, we've looked at, this is something, that's coming very soon from Stoplight, is being able to connect our platform through APIs. So, we've really had to look and be honest with ourselves. What does that do for us? It certainly brings us better qualified leads in some ways. It, makes our churn lower, right? If folks, connect their API designs to the rest of their organization, that's going to reduce our churn. It's going to, increase our positive network effects if we connect other platforms. I'm promising we're going to do that day one, but and really thinking through what are these different relationships that we're going to be involved in, and recognizing, hey, taking on OAuth and connecting with other platforms, that's harder. Let's make sure customers can get their own data first. So, we're drinking our own champagne on these ideals because we don't make dog food. But, so we're just trying to create that first connection point. So, it's super meta, right? Since we do APIs, but it's relevant, I think, at any place you're at, is kind of the point I'm trying to make. So what if you don't do any of these things, right? What if you go, well, that all sounds like a bunch of hooey. I have an engineering background. I know where API is valuable. I'm just going to, build it and stick it out there. Build it and no com, right? What happens? Quite often it can just become, within the business context that you're in, this technical thing, right? It's just this technical commodity. An experience designed by engineers, like, let's be honest, it never goes well, right? And the bottom line is, like, you have to think in customer-centric terms, not in system-centric terms, or it's going to show, and it's not going to be great in terms of building some hype around what you're doing. I'm going to bring it back again. If you're not putting business perspective around why you're building APIs, when it comes time that the crunch comes in the business, you're going to be at the top of the list of the program to kill, right? So making sure that business perspective on why these APIs are valuable is always front and center. It's got to be there, just for defensibility for your program, right? So all of that said, if you haven't tuned in before, I have to do my shill pitch for our podcast, API Intersection. We regularly interview, all kinds of folks who do this for their day job and do it successfully at scale. We're on all the different platforms, so come and check us out. Thanks, y'all. And I guess Shelby is up, right?
Yeah, Shelby's next. Thank you, Jason. Great presentation. A lot of awesome ideas. And I'll be the person that claps since there's no one else to do that without conferences these days. But yeah, understanding those relationships up front, I think is imperative, like you said, and kind of framing things in business terminologies, like you said, and that needs to happen for these executives to have buy-in. And a lot of the time we do kind of consider these as just technical artifacts, but there's so much more that goes into it. So I have some questions, some follow-up, and I know some people in the chat do as well. Let's take things over to Shelby right now and then kind of recover some of those ideas later on.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Can you see my slide?
Looks good to me.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Shelby Switzer. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm going to be talking about designing human-centered APIs. So first, really briefly, a little bit about me. You can find me at Switzerly on Twitter. These are my 2 GitHub handles. I have a personal website that kind of goes over some of the projects that I currently do and have recently been involved in. I am a civic technologist, a community organizer, and a writer. I just started a fellowship at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown, where I work on intergovernmental software collaboration, which I hope will be a lot of APIs and interoperability standards, as well as community building and organizing. I also work intermittently and just finished up a 2.5-year tour of service with the US Digital Service, where I focused on engineering and community, and I'll talk about a few of those projects in this presentation. And generally, my background, I've been doing civic tech and APIs and full stack software development for almost 10 years. And in terms of subject matter, I'm primarily public health, healthcare interoperability, and environmental justice. So this talk, I'm going to go over what is human-centered design. It's probably a term you've heard before, but maybe not one that you've implemented in your company or your organization. We're going to talk about applying human-centered design, or HCD, to API products. And then the bulk of the talk will be around human-centered tactics for your API product, where I'll be going into some of my experiences where I've implemented some of these tactics and lessons learned. So first, what is human-centered design? Human-centered design is an approach to design and problem solving and product design and development that really centers human involvement at every stage, and specifically the humans that you're solving for or serving. It's all about building a deep empathy with the people you're designing for, generating tons of ideas, building a bunch of prototypes, sharing what you've made with the people you're designing for, and eventually putting your innovative solution out in the world. And this quote is taken from designkit.org. This is an open toolkit created by IDEO, which is a design firm that really popularized human-centered design thinking, I think almost a decade ago now, and it's still, going strong in the software product development world and outside of software. There are 3 main phases in a human-centered design approach. The first is inspiration, the second, ideation, and the third is implementation. We're going to go over these and kind of what they mean as concepts first, before talking about how they apply to API product lifecycle. So first, your inspiration. This is the phase where you're really finding your audience or your users and you're listening to them. So you should really be thinking about who are the people you're trying to reach and why. What problems are they trying to solve and what are their motivations? This is also can be phrased as, thinking about what do your users want versus what do they think they want? So you want to listen to them, you want to hear and really try to understand and empathize with what they're saying to you, but you should also be thinking about like the things maybe they're not saying. So their environment, their body language, etc. Taking a really holistic approach to empathizing and trying to listen to and understand your audience and really what they're trying to achieve. Second phase is ideation. So this is the point where you are iterating with humans. So putting pen to paper, building prototypes and getting them into the hands of users as soon as possible. You shouldn't be kind of hoarding and protecting your ideas. You should be getting them out into the world, into the hands of the people who you're trying to help. as quickly as possible, because you will only improve your product through iteration. You should be listening to feedback and acting on it. And I should say, prototype wise, even if you're building a software product or an API, something that I've done in the past with design thinking exercises with teams is doing this really hands-on with pens and paper, with craft supplies like pom-poms and pipe cleaners. And it makes it really super fun, and really kind of brings a new perspective to interacting with prototypes and thinking about the problems you're trying to solve. So be creative. And third phase, finally, implementation. This is the phase where you define success measures or indicators, and you launch with humans. You should be thinking about, what does success look like for you and for your users? Because ultimately, you will only be successful if your users are successful. I really like to think about designing products as adopting a service-oriented mentality and helping to serve the people that you've identified as your users, and making sure that you're putting their success first. And that's how you will be successful with your product. And an important note that we'll really get into later in this talk is how to iterate from feedback, because iteration doesn't stop with launch. You should be continuing to center humans and your users, getting feedback and making changes from it after that first launch. So these are all principles for human-centered design that can be applied to any product, or really any problem that needs to be solved with people and communities or individuals. And what we're going to talk about next is, how does this apply to my API product? Especially given, APIs, sometimes when we're building them, we feel pretty far removed from users. So just to take a step back, a couple of ways that, situations that you might find yourself in, if you're in your own organization thinking about turning your API into a product. These are a couple of typical paths that I've had experience with, mostly the legacy product path. So this is where you have legacy software product. Nobody likes the word legacy, but I'm going to use it anyway. This is where you already have software, but it's never really had an intentionally designed or unified API. It may have one-off integrations, and it probably does, maybe with Salesforce or with the customer, where you're doing batch file transport or things like that. And now you're thinking about, how do we actually build on that, turn this into a unified experience, add features, expand to more customers who want to do more than just file transfer. The second path to producthood that have had experience with is the greenfield API product, or if our API is in the cloud, maybe a green cloud product. And this is where you're going to market from scratch. So you don't actually have any other software, you don't have like a user interface or an app, and your product is an API, and it is brand new. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. But regardless, in both of these cases, and in any other case to API producthood, you have the same user. The users are the same in either case, and those users are scary murderous robots who are trying to take you to the metaverse. Not really. Thanks, Mitchell versus Machines, though. Love that movie. Really, it's people, y'all. The users of any API product are people. They're the developers who are consuming your API, who are building the programs to integrate with it. They're the business people, the product people, and the designers on that developers team who are trying to figure out how your product meets their needs and helps them ultimately serve their own users. And these people, they have problems, they have goals, they have their own lives, they have their business lives, they're outside of the office lives, if they're in an office, they have aspirations, and they have their own motivations. And these are all things that you should be considering as you develop your API product. So how do you do that? Let's talk about some human-centered tactics for your API products. And we're going to bucket these into the 3 phases that we've already discussed. So first, starting with inspiration. So you really should inspire and learn from your users and try to understand them through immersion. Go on site with your users, and go on site if you can with your users' users. And I say that because often when we're building APIs, we're building B2B products. Sometimes you're building a B2C product. I've had experience with that, and I'll talk about that in my next slide, actually. But usually we're building for people who have their own products and who are trying to improve their products and help serve their own users. And this is something you have to keep in mind. And the best way to understand that and to empathize with your users' experiences and the people they're trying to serve is to be in person with them. Go on site if you can. I know we're still in a pandemic, so this might need to be virtual, but ask to shadow, ask to screen share with them, do real interviews over video calls or in person. Don't just send surveys. Because understanding the context, environment, and constraints are as important as and part of understanding the motivations of your users. And will help you ideate and build better products that are more practical and can actually be implemented. So a couple of stories that I have here to talk through how I've learned this is represented by the graphic I've chosen, a hospital. You can see in the bottom, we actually have a developer, an IT person hacking away on something for the providers at the hospital to use as maybe part of their electronic health record system or other of the many hundreds of systems that might be in place in a hospital. And then above them, we actually have providers delivering healthcare to patients. So I've worked on a couple of products here at the US Digital Service where we have practiced immersion, going on site, going where the work is and designing with users. The first one was actually my first project at USDS called Data at the Point of Care. This was a greenfield API product. There wasn't anything in place before. I mean, there were some systems, but this was a total fresh go-to-market API that was really about exposing Medicare claims data in bulk directly to providers at the point of care. And really, we were trying to help providers solve the problem of not knowing anything about a new patient's healthcare situation. So when you first go to a new provider, let's say you're going to urgent care and maybe you are a Medicare patient, a recipient beneficiary, and you maybe have seen like 10 specialists in the past 3 years, you've had some preventative screenings, you're on 10 medications, you probably can't remember half of these things. I know I don't really have very many healthcare concerns, fortunately, but I can't remember a lot, any of the details. So expecting your patients who are going through a lot to remember any of this is just unrealistic. So if you're working with patients, you want to know their healthcare history, you can't necessarily ask them. And you also don't have time to go call all 10 of those specialists to try to get data faxed to you, because that's how people transmit data in healthcare still is faxing. But one through line that we heard from providers over and over again was that if they could just access, claims data, and this is something that we ideated with them, accessing claims data gives you that clear throughput of what's happened with a patient, because despite all the different providers they may have seen, they've all billed to the same person, and that's Medicare, at least with Medicare beneficiaries. So if providers can access that claims data easily and quickly at the time of care, then they can deliver much better informed care to their patients. So with this product, we actually visited hospitals, we went to their IT labs, so we met with the developers who would be integrating with our API. We got to see firsthand kind of the organizational context that they were in to better understand, their programming skills, the skills of the developer teams, the people on the developer teams and the designer teams, how the organization was thinking about IT decisions and their approach to innovation and trying new products. That was all something that we got by being in person that we could not have gotten a different way. And then we also went on site into some provider clinics to better understand the setting in which they were using the products that were being built with our API. And this became extremely important on a second project that I was on with the CDC called PRIME. And this is Pandemic Ready Interoperable Modernization Effort. Great acronym. I'm super proud of that one. But really, we were trying to build more modern, interoperable public health infrastructure. And when you hear infrastructure, you should think APIs. And in this case, we actually went on site with multiple states and cities and towns to visit COVID testing sites, state and county health departments, labs, and providers to better understand the data flow from COVID testing sites and from providers, clinics, to the federal government to better inform the federal response to the pandemic. And going on site gave us so much insight that we could use with our API design. We could better see how providers were collecting data from patients, the types of questions being asked, what patients were likely, how they were likely to respond, which really, changed how we thought about validations for data in our API structure. We also saw how people were doing really creative things with Excel macros, tying together multiple computers and lab equipment because there just weren't APIs for those things. And that really helped shape, how we designed APIs and prioritized features, as well as thought about interoperability. So all that to say, going on site is incredibly valuable. Don't stay in your office, don't stay behind your desk, go talk to people virtually if that's the only way that you can do it. And don't only understand their context, but understand the users that they're trying to serve, because that will ultimately influence what's possible with your API and what kind of new opportunities you might see. So second phase, ideation. So my key recommendation here with ideation is to rapidly prototype with users and pizza or other types of incentives or compensation. Use prototyping tools like API blueprints or maybe Stoplight to design and mock your API, and then ask users to try to build with it. Don't wait till you've already built the whole thing to ask users to give feedback, because then it will be really hard to change. You'll already have like tests in place, hopefully. You'll already have all this stuff built out. And there are so many tools these days where you can just start with your design and you can spin up a Node.js server. There's lots of open API tools, et cetera, for this. You don't have to build anything for the feedback process. And then you can do this super rapidly. You can get feedback and you can change your API prototype, even in just one session. So my story here is when I worked at a startup called Notion. This was a home sensor company recently acquired. And we had an API. This was actually a B2C company working, selling to homeowners to, place sensors in their house, like on doors or to detect water and smoke, et cetera. And we had an API for the hackers of our customers, home hackers. And we held prototype hackathons to rapidly iterate on our REST API and webhooks. So, all in one session, we kind of have people come together for an evening. We would have an API blueprint with a mock server. We'd ask people to build against this server to try to solve some problem of interest. Maybe, for example, integrating our API with Minecraft, which is something that you can do, which is super fun. So asking people to build against that prototype in the mock, give us feedback about what that experience was. Were the endpoints correct? Maybe were there too many endpoint hops? Do we need to kind of combine some things? Was the data easy to use, et cetera? And then we gave them pizza. People hung out for 20 minutes while I went to go change the API blueprint and update the mock server. And then we did it again. So over a very course period of time, you can actually go in, change that design, and then based on the feedback that you've gotten, and ask people to do again, see if they've had a better experience, which is incredibly helpful. You don't have to do it all in one session like that. In other scenarios, I've done this over a longer course of time, but it's really important to have get something in people's hands to give you feedback with, and then make changes and show you're making changes based on the feedback. This is a really easy way to win over customers and users by showing them that they're valued because you're actually making changes. I was once a user in an API pilot program. I won't name the name of the company, but I was in the pilot program. I gave them some feedback because they were using the 200 status code for everything. Not a good idea. I gave them that feedback that maybe they shouldn't do that. And they told me that they weren't going to change it because that's not how they do things. And I was like, what's the point of doing a pilot where you're getting feedback if you're not going to listen to feedback? So that was really unfortunate. Don't be like that. Actually make changes, show that you're listening to people, because otherwise what's the point? And I will just also make the comment that, I did the pizza thing way back when, obviously we could be in person. There are other ways to do this. Use Scriblio or have other breaks and stuff to make this a fun event. And also consider paying people. This makes for a more equitable research experience and compensates people for the energy they're putting into your product strategy. So just stuff to keep in mind. And then finally, phase 3, implementation. Really want to emphasize that you should continue to iterate and version with users. I see a lot of people put out APIs in version 1, and then it's just in version 1 for like a year, 2 years. It never changes because it can feel really hard to change an API because of the amount of work that goes into integrating with it. People might not have the time or the resources to keep up with changes, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't change and version, and that you shouldn't make it easy to version and change. Can you imagine putting out an application or a website and like never changing it? That would be ridiculous. So you should not think that's okay with an API. So it's really important to have that versioning strategy from the outset. Pro tip, you can actually get user feedback on your versioning strategy before you launch, so that you like understand what might actually be best suited for your customers and how often they're going to be able to make changes. And you can then use human-centered design and human-centered indicators, success measures to guide new version releases. So again, like taking feedback, also taking, monitoring through logs and analytics, and real conversations with people to update to your next version. So at a recent company before US Digital Service, I was working at a company called Healthify, a healthcare technology company focused on the social determinants of health. We had kind of a legacy software approach to the path to having an API product. And we use the API blueprint prototype approach that I mentioned before for new versions. So we had an API, and as we decided what we wanted to change about it and maybe create new versions based on feedback, and again, also through real conversations with customers, we would mock up the new version in an API blueprint with a mock server. We'd send it out to some identified customers, and we'd ask like, hey, does this better suit your needs? How does this work for you? Is this going to break anything? Is this are these changes things that you can implement quickly and easily? And what kind of tooling or support do you need to be able to do that? So then we were able to actually get feedback and make really important versioning decisions to keep our API product moving forward and continuing to serve and evolve and meet the needs of new customers while still maintaining the relationships with our previous ones. And also through monitoring analytics, if we saw that people were stopping their use of an API or maybe not using certain endpoints, we just reached out and asked why, to better understand and help shape the product strategy in future versions. So please don't call it quits and that you're done with version 1, because you're not. And you should really be thinking about evolving this and working with humans and with users to inform your strategy and keep moving forward in the market. So finally, in conclusion, I think I'm still under time, so this is good. The human-centered design phases are inspiration, ideation, implementation, and 3 tactics that I hope that you can apply to your own API products are first, learn from immersion with your users and their users. If you can, don't just send out surveys, don't just talk to like one person, really try to understand their environment and context, their skill sets, their experience, their motivations. It will greatly inform your strategy and help you build a better API. Second, rapidly prototype with users and pizza or other forms of compensation or fun. Keep it fun. That's always a good life tip. And make sure you're actually iterating from feedback. Don't just get feedback and file it in a drawer somewhere. It's not helpful to anybody. And third, continue to iterate and version with users. Don't call it quits. Don't stop talking to people just because you've gotten the API out the door. Keep talking to people, keep versioning, and keep solving for your user needs, because those will probably change and you will also have new users that you should be serving to. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby. Great ideas throughout. It's really good to know that it's not just scary, murderous robots using APIs, because I was a little afraid, honestly. I mean, if you look at the logs for most of these services, that's kind of all you see, right? Apps, calling apps. It's very machine language driven, and we don't always realize that at least creating that first integration involves a lot of human effort up front. I really love the emphasis on like going on site, understanding real issues. That's something that no one really talks about in this space, and actually talking with not even the users of your API, but their end users as well. I mean, I think that really goes to Jason's point as well. about like building for that network effect and like really supporting the marketplace in a more holistic manner. So yeah, really cool ideas. That your thing about like offering compensation for feedback was kind of new to me. I mean, it makes sense. Like we've seen that happen in hackathons, but I think what you're suggesting was kind of like a more formal, less competitive approach, kind of like that classic product testing kind of group format, if I understood things correctly.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm especially coming from it from the perspective too of building products and trying to create like a diverse user base. So making sure that people who are maybe less represented in your user samples, people you talk to because they just don't have the time, helping to compensate them for their time is a really good way to make sure that you're getting diverse participants.
Yeah. Throughout your presentation, I just kept thinking about Jason's points on getting that buy-in for these sort of programs. And I was curious, Jason, if you think kind of highlighting the end user benefits can be a good selling point to executives, the user experience and efficiency benefits and whatnot.
Yes and no. So I think going and saying, hey, if we do this stuff, and we invest smart, and, we do all the right things like Shelby's talking about, developers will like us. It's like, to your average exec, like, why do I care? Like,
Right. Yeah.
how is that going to grow our business? So I think a lot of what Shelby's talking about, by the way, Shelby, I love it. Like I use the phrase like, pizza and beer will solve most of your problems, right? Find an incentive to get feedback, early releases, that kind of thing. Super important. I think a lot of that is more of like the tactical details of once you're moving. And I think the value of why developers matter in creating those network effects is great to explain. But as far as like, why does the experience matter? It set aside APIs as products. If you went and pitched, say, a mobile app or web app, and you said, well, the reason it's important is because it's going to have a great experience for users. That would be like, why would you do? You wouldn't do that, right? Like, of course, you might say that's the standard we want to hold ourselves to. Remember, we're developing the practice of developer experience, which is a different toolbox than user experience, but the concepts are the same.
I see.
Yeah. And I would add too that like, I think when you're trying to sell your API to execs, if you just focus on the user problems and the problems of the customers, and you show like, clearly having a user interface is not always the best way to help your users solve their problems. And you need an API, then I think, as long as you can center that in your customer needs, then you should hopefully be successful.
Excellent. We did receive a question from a viewer. Kelly Dyer is asking, what makes good versus bad API documentation? What are the absolute essentials needed for documentation? I think I'll let Jason start this one off.
I think the first one is like, don't confuse that API reference is a full-bodied kind of documentation, right? Being able to say, here's the list of APIs, here's all the parameters and all that stuff. Yeah, you got to have that reference material. But where there's a few key value points. One is really sit down and go through getting started. What does it take? And most times, half of that content is authentication authorization, right? The old joke that like a 2-day hackathon, day one is auth. Getting the auth part right is usually a huge barrier. And then the second piece to getting started will lead you down the road of realizing there's often flow through APIs. You don't call one API to do the thing you need. You're often calling multiple things, and it takes some kind of a guide. And I always say, like, business or developers try, business buys. Start with a business context. Start with the functional description of what the thing does and what this flow does, not how to call it. So that when everyone's looking at it, they can go, we understand what this does and it fits our needs. And then they'll end up in the reference material eventually when they're implementing it. But that initial evaluation phase and the kind of, comprehensibility of what does this thing do is really important to punch through. And I would follow up with pizza and beer goes a long way here too. hopefully you're documenting up front to some extent. And in those early kind of feedback sessions, don't send them a PDF, send them to whatever sort of portal that you're using. And there's lots of ways to auto-generate that now. Plug for our Elements open source thing, right? It's free. Go do something like that against your spec. With mocks, I love Shelby's recommendation there. Let people try to walk through the docs and accomplish a task. Say, can you go do this thing? And that will tell you whether or not the docs are good enough and where things are stuck.
I think PDF versus open public docs is an easy good versus bad example of API documentation. I also personally believe it shouldn't be paywalled. Like, it should be accessible. I mean, APIs are secured correctly. What do you think there? It just depends on the circumstance.
Depends. I tend to agree with you. As a default state, yes. But there are certainly situations out there where, there might be a sort of competitive factor, that you want to kind of keep things a little bit under a lid, especially if it's, for a small partner network that's a little bit more bespoke. So it depends. But yeah, as in most cases, that's a good default state.
In most cases. Shelby, any thoughts on what makes good versus bad API docs?
I mean, agreed. Don't have PDF documentation. Keep it open if at all possible, which should be possible. And then kind of building off of what Jason said around thinking about tasks. I think good documentation understands what users are probably trying to achieve with your API and like the problems they're solving and what they might want to do. So structuring your documentation that way, instead of just having a list of endpoints and, request responses, but really thinking about what are people trying to achieve, solving for your major problems that, most of your users are coming to your API for. Helping them do that quickly and efficiently is probably the most important thing for good documentation.
Completely. I'd also like to touch on what are the other components and features that you really need in your developer center or portal. I mean, we talk a lot about documentation, but like we've said, the reference is only one aspect. I mean, I feel like developer users should be able to see their usage patterns, their histories, great logging, there should be account management, like a portal to manage all of that. And of course, input like monetization, if that's part of it. Am I forgetting anything? Like, what else goes into making a great developer center that is productized?
Definitely, yes, logs around errors and success for your API requests. That is so important, but I don't see it that often. But it's super helpful when troubleshooting.
The only other one I'd chip in is some kind of sandbox or kind of environment function. If you only have one API that's against real production data, the moment your consumers have to go make an iterative change on their consumption, it can be, dangerous, right? They could end up breaking something that's actually flowing lots of money for you both. So having some way to test change is pretty essential.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I guess I would add is notifications for changes and versioning, kind of those alerts. So all this to me is a part of documentation. It's just maybe not called documentation. It's more of the developer experience and the portal associated with it. Thanks for entertaining that question. We just got a new one in. I'm going to turn to Shelby for this one. Where do you find good examples of APIs for civil tech?
Totally. So I'll link to one of the ones that I mentioned, data at the point of care. I think this is a really great example of an amazing API product that came out of government. So there's a sandbox, there's a clear understanding of like why you might want to use this API. There's documentation, there's a Google group where the product team is active and responding to feedback and requests and questions. Otherwise, let me think. I'm gonna have to probably sit and think for a minute. There are lots of good examples. A lot of federal governments are starting to really shift their IT departments, start thinking about APIs. CMS has a number of other APIs that are really good that I can link to in a minute. And CDC, as I said before in my talk, is also doing some interesting API work. So let me go find some links and I'll send some in the chat.
Yeah, very cool. I've also noticed individual cities participating in like open data and smart city stuff. I know the smart city concept was really in vogue like a few years ago. I haven't seen as much interest in that, but I think these services are still out there.
Yeah, on that note, Denver has some good APIs, like the RTD, their transit department has some really good APIs actually, that are amazing and well documented. And then NYC has NYC Planning Labs, which do some really good work. Yes, and the college scorecard has an API as well. Thanks, Tracy.
Cool. Jason, any to add to that list of civic kind of tech?
No, this is Shelby's wheelhouse. I'll let
Yeah,
her take
it's
it.
Shelby's world, definitely. Cool. I think those were mainly the questions I had here. And anything else we wanted to add to top off this event?
A late breaking question that everyone loves on incorporating security in APIs.
Yeah, maybe we should cover that a bit.
Yeah, I think that the thing that I really learned this last year is, we always thought of it as like, okay, the API is out there, make sure that all the network stuff and server configuration, everything's secure. That first of all, I would point everyone to the OWASP API top 10. Hopefully in your overall security, you're looking at the OWASP top 10, but the API top 10 is kind of a little bit purpose built. And I would certainly encourage that during your design phase, where you're, kind of going through all these things Shelby was talking about, iterating on what's the right design, you can solve a huge proportion of security holes in the design phase, being intentional on like, how are you going to authenticate to this thing and does it make sense, right? With third-party consent and auth kind of flows, use OAuth, like don't make up a new thing. That's silly. That's just going to get you in trouble. And if you're building a thing and you haven't thought about auth and you're about to release it, like you are in serious trouble, pump the brakes, right? So point being, most of the security problems are just in the definition of auth that you could have done, that you should be doing during design, not when you're about to go to production.
Right. Shelby, any thoughts around security, access control when it comes to productization of APIs?
Just that you should really be thinking about your users and what's possible for them. Yeah, agreed with the OWASP suggestion. But if you're working with customers who, maybe are using JavaScript as their primary development tool, like that might lead you to make different security or authentication decisions than say somebody who's doing server-to-server authentication. So know your users.
Awesome. All right, I think, oh, okay. We have one more question coming in about how to measure the success of an API, which if we're thinking in product terms is pretty important, right? We want to gauge the success, especially if it's monetized. That's pretty easy to monitor if it's profitable or not. But if it's not, if it's something that's we're treating like a product for an internal asset, how do we measure success? Maybe Jason?
At this point, I think it's getting dated. But, and I actually meant to plug this today, I do it in almost every deck around kind of APIs and business, is John Musser's, 20 API business models in 20 minutes, I think is a real eye opener for a lot of folks that are new to APIs, because the default state is you go, well, how many calls are we doing? Or, these kind of technical measures that are usually useless. Like they don't usually tell you anything about your business. And so this is kind of back to that question is, how does the API affect your business? How does it integrate it into your business? The measures are often business measures, right? And APIs are everywhere now. It's not a software company thing anymore. So it depends, right? What is your business? What is the API doing for it? Measure that, not technical measures.
Okay. Shelby, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that there's like a mix of quantitative and qualitative measures that you should think about. Definitely like you should have analytics in place. You should be looking at who's using things, how often things are being used. You should be looking at your business's, bottom line, and are you making money from this thing, and are you expanding your user base? But you should also be talking to your users and understanding, is this really helping them? Can they actually be doing this better? Would a new endpoint be helpful? And are they ultimately improving their bottom line? Because if they're not improving theirs, then eventually they're going to move to somebody else or cease to exist.
Awesome. On that note, I think there are some interesting new measurements coming out, like time to first call. I've noticed in the API community is starting to become this sort of guiding light when it comes to API onboarding and making that process extremely smooth. If we were to talk technical details, which Jason just said we shouldn't, do you do you notice any other metrics we should really be focusing on? If it's not, you know, that KPI, maybe like the number of monthly users or whatnot.
I mean, you should be measuring those things. You're right, but in your DevOps team, not in your boardroom, right?
Sure.
Oh, now you got me lost thinking about that. Sorry, say the question again. I started thinking about DevOps.
Yeah, no worries. We're always thinking about what's the easiest route to onboard a new developer.
Oh, right.
A lot of companies are starting to actually measure that time it takes from sign up to the first call.
The time to first hello world thing has been around for a while, right? This is not a new idea at all. And I think the only thing I worry about when folks talk about that is that, you know, how are you determining that? And sometimes that can kind of turn into a bad game, right? It's like, oh, well, we're just going to bring in some people inside the company who don't know anything about the business that we're doing in this segment to try this thing. And as long as, you know, they can follow directions, it's good enough. It's like, I think Shelby's kind of direction, you know, get out from behind the desk, right? Really go talk to folks. I think if you're doing it the right way, that certainly can be a valuable measure, but also the idea that every API should be callable and useful in 5 minutes, it doesn't always actually make sense. So I think it can set up some bad incentives and kind of bad behavior if you're not really cautious about that. And so I don't always like, I don't like to apply that as just, it works everywhere. It works sometimes.
Okay. Yeah, Shelby, similar thoughts there?
No, I just echo those.
Yeah, because I've noticed people using it, but if it's not time to first call to something that's actionable and useful in production and actually, you know, serving a valid use case, more, you know, if it's just like user creation call, that's like very easy to implement, but actually seeing value is a whole different story.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
it's
not a silver bullet, right? And
yeah.
I think like looking at actual people doing stuff or really looking through like kind of a more nuanced, detailed flow of what all calls are they making, in what order, where are they hitting errors, doing that deep dive is far more informative. And I think sometimes folks go, oh, time to first hello world, we'll just do that. We'll do a monthly workshop thing and bring in some strangers to do this thing. And then we tick the box and we have good developer experience. Very rarely is true.
Well, as we've discovered today, it requires a lot of forethought and effort to really optimize that. So I think we'll cap things off right there. Thanks for staying a little bit over the time and answering these questions. Really appreciate both of you for tuning in for Nordic APIs.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
Awesome.
y'all.
I'm just going to do some outro tidbits. Feel free to stick around or go on to your next meetings. So this has been another LiveCast presentation. Just a few quick updates from the world of Nordic APIs before we sign off. Help us choose a theme for our next LiveCast, please. You can head over to the Nordic APIs LinkedIn to let us know what topic you'd most like to hear about. We're thinking of topics like serving APIs with Kubernetes, implementing zero trust across your platform, different API economy trends, and then kind of a revisiting API design best practices. So the poll's on LinkedIn. It's valid for a few more days. Check it out if you'd like to give us your thoughts. We do have an API as a product ebook out there. You can visit that and download it for free. There's no email gate associated with this. It's in all the e-reader formats. Or visit the blog for these articles too. We sort of tend to organize them into ebooks every other quarter. If you love APIs, have ideas, want to share some best practices, consider contributing your thoughts to our blog. We have a decent reach and can help spread the word in the community. And with that being said, we do have a newsletter. You can subscribe anytime. If you're sick of doom scrolling on social media and just want some API insights in your email inbox, this could be a great alternative. And thank you, as always, to Nordic API's sponsor, Curity. You can learn more about their OAuth server and identity-driven API security solutions at curity.io. All right, thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you at the next LiveCast, everybody.